So Baptiste Morizot is maître de conférence, associate professor in philosophy at the Université Aix-Marseille. His dissertation on the philosopher Gilbert Simondon, best known for his theory of individuation, was published by Vrin in 2016. His research extends this philosophy of the constitutive relations between the individual and the milieu to questions of geopolitical interactions with the non-human. In his groundbreaking book, which I have here, Les diplomates, Cohabiter avec les loups sur une autre carte du vivant, published in 2016, he analyzes the question of the return of wolves in France and points out our inability to communicate in the language of the other. He argues then for a new relationship with wolves founded on recent research in ethology, on an ethics of the relationship, and on the politics of diplomacy. Today, he will present on his recent research, which I believe is titled Homesick at Home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers. So I changed my topic today. I won't talk about wild diplomacy, or I will rather try to address a problem that I tragically failed to address in my research, which is climate change. So I'm now trying to address this elephant in the room, which is climate change, and I try to think about it in relationship with the idea of diplomacy with the living beings. So today I will try to present you an idea that struck me this summer, and I'm not sure it works. So that's why I will give it to your critics. My problem is what kind of affects are able to make us process climate change. According to me, the way environmental crises affect our forms of life is an enigma. I think the situation is quite clear. The Earth's habitability is being deteriorated by certain practices of the land. But the implications of this phenomenon for our living condition have, in the same sense we say human condition, is still unclear and ambiguous. My question is, what could be the condition of living beings in those times? And what I think is a weak signal, like the prospectivist says, is the fact that we can feel we are no longer at home. And what does it mean to be no longer at home? To me, it means that home, in its constancy, with the regularity of seasons and the cycle of predictable natural events, is metamorphosing under the effects of climate change. So we are moving towards an era where tragedies of habitation will happen on a daily basis. Droughts, damaging crops, floods, destroying homes, brutal biological invasions, undoing ancient co-evolutions between life forms of ecosystems. And these transformations, which will induce food and health crises, call for something we could call a culture of engagement regarding how to engage in multiple ways, political but not only political ways, in environmental issues. But my feeling is that the very possibility of reacting to these transformations, critical transformations, this way, I mean in a productive way, lies in the type of affective tonality through which this era will be processed. So what kind of affects are there to process climate change? The first kind of affects, I think, and the most spectacular, is visible into the catastrophist rhetoric, which is omnipresent in France. I don't know if in America this catastrophic rhetoric is quite present. And I think the kind of affect that this catastrophic rhetoric produces is inhibiting, and it's emotionally unsustainable. And the risk of this kind of affects is that it leads to denial and resignation. My idea is that behind this affective tonality, which activates the powers of fear, there is another effect, more subtle, an effect which perhaps emerges like our condition of living beings caught in a state of mutual vulnerability with other living beings in this new era. To formulate this affect, I'd like to start with an example. In France, this summer, the leaves of deciduous trees fell in the middle of summer, in the month of August this year. I witnessed this phenomenon at the bottom of the gorge of a river, the Chéran River in Haute-Savoie. And it was really ambiguous. It was an ambiguous enchantment because it was the heart of summer, so the weather was really hot, but we could see the yellow leaves of trees falling like in autumn. This kind of phenomenon can be explained in plant ecology, and it is a direct consequence of global warming in the form of water stress induced by a lack of water in trees. What happens is simply that when the heat wave hits the leaves, they can no longer sweat, they close their stomata, and at that moment, the temperature of the leaf becomes too hot, and the leaf dies, the pigments are destroyed, they turn yellow, they die, and they fall. But describing the biological phenomenon does not convey, I think, the fundamental affective dimension of this situation. And that is what I want to try to express here. Imagine you're on a river and exposed simultaneously to the heat of the water, characteristic of the middle of August, but you are surrounded by plants whose intense green is characteristic of heavy rainy springs, and you are simultaneously exposed to the yellow autumn leaves falling into the current of the river. To me, it's an image of a new kind of experience. This river is a place I have known forever, but it is no longer the same. And in this kind of situation, we are now living in the concatenation of 3 seasons in the same landscape, because the very cycle of seasons has been damaged. And in this way, home is no longer recognizable. It's analogous to this tragic illness of the mind. I think it's called syndrome of Capgras, where the most intimate faces of your relatives, of your family, appear to be those of strangers. You can't recognize them. So my question is, how can we give a meaning and a form to this effect of distress and of disorientation induced by the fact of seeing the known world transform and in some way disintegrate around us? The first answer to this is, I think, a quite beautiful concept proposed by the philosopher Glenn Albrecht in 2005, and it's the concept of solastalgia. Solastalgia is a concept originally a psychoclinical concept, which has been coined to qualify states of psychological and existential stress and anxiety induced by the loss of the comfort, the solace, of a familiar world, of a home, but without having moved of your home. It's a loss induced by global climate change. In the work of Glenn Albrecht, solastalgia is above all a feeling of powerlessness, and it's metabolized differently by populations depending on their connection to the land, their standard of living, their vulnerability. So he works about this feeling of solastalgia in herders in Africa, where droughts are killing their stock, or he worked with this concept with Aboriginal populations of Australia. Here, I would like to take into account the philosophical implications of the phenomenon of solastalgia. I would like to extend the concept to describe not only one specific psychological distress, but also something like our contemporary living condition induced by environmental metamorphosis. In Down to Earth, written by Bruno Latour, there is that little idea, very provocative in first sight, that the climatic migrant may be the central figure of our times. First sight, it's provocative, but I think it's very profound. And in some way, it's this idea I'd like to follow up on here. I'd like to dig in. Solastalgia, in this sense, the sense which interests me here, is an affect qualifying an immobile exile, an affect which makes the most sedentary among us experience the loss and the wandering that the exiled have described and have sung. Solastalgia is the nostalgia of a home that is nevertheless still there, but which flees underfoot. It is something like a saudade, you know, the Brazilian concept of saudade. It is a saudade sung from the kitchen window that talks about our longing for a familiar, immemorial world which is metamorphosing before our eyes and which is becoming alien. A familiar world, your home, becoming a stranger. So the first philosophical implication that can be drawn from this concept is that there is here a symmetrical inversion of the figure of the stranger. In our tradition, the stranger was this exiled individual passing fleetingly through an immutable world, and he is now the very environment that reconfigures itself faster than a human life. The environment becomes a stranger because it changes faster and around an individual more enduring than the surrounding landscape. The ephemeral human is now more stable than his environment and less perishable. Imagine the fact that a third of the world's living species, each millions of years old, could disappear before you within the course of a human life. And these populations of living beings are not replaceable elements placed on the landscape scenery. They are the landscape because they are actors of the ecological dynamics that build it, like Emmanuel Ikecha puts it beautifully yesterday. So, this idea that the stranger changed of nature, it is not the individual but the environment which changed now, which is more ephemeral than his environment, I think is one of the enigma of our contemporary condition. The idea of a living environment that is now unstable and alien, disintegrating itself around an individual who has become the fixed point while being very aware of his fragility. That's what I call homesickness, but at home. The second philosophical implication of solastalgia, like one affects to process climate change, is that it's a nostalgia for a world where our relationships with the non-humans around us were well stabilized. I think it's a definition of home. Home is a place where you have stabilized your relationships with non-humans around you. And what happens now is that our relationships with all those non-humans are now destabilized. What is interesting in that is that there is a concept in animistic cosmologies to qualify this phenomenon, and they call this time of myth. It's not exactly mythical times. Time of myth is a formula to express a kind of time which is at the origin of stabilized time, and in which the creatures, the living beings, the elements are not individuated, are not separated, are not stabilized. One example you can refer to is the dreaming in Aboriginal cosmologies. In modern traditions, we interpret the idea of time of myth like a past, a very ancient past, which will not come back. But it is a modern view of this phenomenon. In Aboriginal cosmologies, the time of myth can come back at any time. And it comes back every time something really particular happens. It comes back when the beings of metamorphosis proliferate. The idea is quite simple. In the animistic tradition, people have stabilized social relationships with animals, vegetables, plants, weather, but there still are some types of creatures with whom they cannot stabilize relationships. But these creatures, which are mythical creatures, are rare. And at some point, these rare creatures proliferate and they become the norm. And the idea that the anthropologist Nastasia Martin defends here is that we can think this proliferation of living beings or elements with whom our relationships are not stabilized, like the return of the time of myth. In the time of myth, the other forms of life are mysterious. And I think it is something we can feel today. Now that we are discovering the prodigious properties of Gaia, the Earth system, we are discovering the prodigious properties of the microbiota that makes every human a multi-species symbiote. Now we discover that trees can communicate through vast networks of mycorrhizae. The time of myth, to me, is a concept which enlightens the phenomenon that the ancient nature transformed into metamorphic beings. Seasons, environments, living beings have not been stabilized or are destabilized, and that's why we can think this phenomenon like a return of the time of myth in the modern world. This phenomenon can be seen in the fact that we no longer know how to interact with soils. And that's what I mean saying our relationships are not stabilized. We don't know how to interact with soils because techno-scientific agriculture weakens and destroys soils. In other words, the microfauna of the soils demands to be treated differently, and we have now to learn who is the soil and who is this microfauna to stabilize new relationships and sustainable, decent relationships with the soil. In the same way, Europe's pollinators, like bees, for example, are also demanding a different treatment. We no longer know how to establish sustainable and decent relationships with these beings. They are becoming beings of metamorphosis. It appears that we were mistaken about what we thought they were. We were mistaken about the identities we modern had assigned to them. We do not know what needs to be done to make a dialogue or a diplomacy with these living beings possible. And yet, it is they who make the world, like soil columbolas that allow the emergence of social relationships between plants, and forests that generate the breathable atmosphere. Once mere physical and biological matter, they are now mysterious beings whose powers and properties surpass us. That's what I call beings of metamorphosis. In investigating now this effect of solastalgia, simultaneously reveals that the times we are living are something like a curse, but if we interpret them with the concept of time of myth, they look like also an opportunity to start something again. And that's my second and last point, because I think solastalgia is not the only metamorphosis affecting our relationship with the surrounding world. I think the contemporary environmental, scientific, and philosophical mutations weave solastalgia with another affect, an affect with it which is more active and more improbable in these tragical times, and I call that affect the unexplored. So there is, on the one hand, solastalgia, which consists in no longer recognizing at the window the seasons, the living beings, the landscapes. And this is the profound meaning, since there is one today, of the French formula, il n'y a plus de saison. But there is also another affective tonality attached to solastalgia. It is the feeling that the world we thought completely surveyed, completely registered, documented, elucidated, in every aspect, has become again a world unexplored. And from the closest to the most distant, unexplored. Feeling that there were still unexplored parts of the world was experienced by the explorers of the 20th century. And in the 20th century, the last explorers were chasing fragments of unexplored lands, fragments of white on the maps. But now, these white became the world. These unexplored patches extended to the whole world because we ignore the nature of all those living and non-living phenomena that are transformed by the new dynamics of climate change and the transformations of science and philosophy, which occurs in a parallel way. So, what I'm trying to do here has been called for by Bruno Latour in Comment s'orienter en politique. And in a very incidental sentence, he suggests to give philosophy the task of reassigning powerful modern affects that have been emptied out and which are, in a sense, available. So the affect I am now trying to reassign, because I think it has carried the West throughout modernity and is now singularly diverted, is the epistemological and political affect of exploration. And this affect, I think, is quite strong, but it's really complicated to reassign, because the figure of the explorer, the Western explorer, is rightly considered now as the scout of imperialism, as the prospector of extractivism, and as the bridgehead of colonialism. So the affect of exploration, which I think is exhilarating and perhaps present in everyone, is now rendered inaccessible because of the dark complicities of the figure of the explorer. This is why my problem, and I won't have the time to address it, is to liberate the exploratory affect from the dubious figure of the Western explorer. I'd like to reassign this affect that has been kidnapped by Stanley, the Victorian colonialist, or the Captain Cook, discoverer and conqueror of Australia. The kind of character which, for me, reveals the new form of exploration is somebody like Anna Tsing, for example. I think Anna Tsing uses and reveals this effect of exploration. I'd like to conclude, because I won't have time, on the specificity of this affect. What interests me in that is, I think, the core of the affect of exploration is it's the affect of wonder. And Lauren Daston, in a great book about wonder, said wonder is a cognitive passion. Cognitive passion means that it weaves together thought and sensibility, and it weaves affiliations towards what is investigated, which makes spontaneously wonder a political passion, because wonder induces a movement of commitment towards what is explored and against what destroys it. So to conclude, because it's time, I'd like to, my goal here was to try to understand the ambivalence, what we can imagine with the figure of the Roman god Janus, Janus bifrons, this god with two faces. These two faces, to me, are weaved, and they can capture a certain kind of affect induced by climate change, but it's a subtle affect. The first figure is solastalgia, homesickness but at home. But I think solastalgia is not only an anxiety. It creates necessarily the fact that the world is unexplored. We are not at home. We are exiled at home because the world is unexplored. And to me, it's a kind of affect that can, when it is politically reinterpreted, permit us to process some of the aspects of climate change. Thank you very much.